My name is Sarah. I'm 34 years old, and I'm writing this with trembling hands because I need someone to understand what happened to me. What I allowed to happen to me. The coffee shop where I sit now buzzes with life, couples laughing over shared desserts, friends planning weekend adventures, while I stare at the empty chair across from me where my husband used to sit every Sunday morning. Where he promised me forever would begin. I gave them everything. My family, my friends, my heart, my soul, my dreams, my money, my time, my energy, my hope. I gave until there was nothing left of who I used to be, until I became a hollow shell walking through life, smiling when expected, crying only in bathroom stalls and empty parking lots. The irony cuts deep because I thought giving everything meant loving completely. I believed that sacrifice was the purest form of devotion, that emptying myself would fill others with enough love to sustain us all. Instead, I learned that some people are bottomless pits of need, and no matter how much you pour into them, they'll always demand more while giving you nothing but criticism, disappointment, and the kind of pain that rewrites your DNA. It started small, as these things always do. Little requests, tiny compromises, minor adjustments to who I was to accommodate who they needed me to be. I didn't recognize the erosion happening inside me, how each yes to them was a no to myself, how every time I bent to fit their expectations, I broke a little piece of my own foundation. The realization hits me now like ice water in my veins. 20 years. That's how long I spent believing that love meant disappearing. It began with my mother, who taught me that good daughters never say no, never complain, never have needs that inconvenience others. She molded me like clay, pressing and reshaping until I forgot my original form. When I graduated high school, instead of pursuing the art scholarship I'd earned, I stayed home to care for her after her knee surgery. 1 month became 6, 6 became 2 years, and by then, my dreams felt like silly childhood fantasies. She recovered completely, of course, but somehow I'd become indispensable. Every grocery run, every doctor's appointment, every lonely evening became my responsibility. I convinced myself this was noble, that I was being a loving daughter. The truth was, I was being trained. Trained to believe my worth came from my usefulness, that my value was measured by how much of myself I could erase to make others comfortable. College waited, then slipped away entirely. My friends moved on to careers and relationships while I became a professional people pleaser, a full-time emotional caretaker for someone who saw my devotion as her due. When I finally met David at 26, I thought I'd found my escape. He was charming, ambitious, and seemed different from the takers in my life. He noticed me in ways others hadn't, complimented my cooking, my laugh, the way I listened without judgment. For the first time, I felt seen. What I didn't understand then was that predators have excellent vision for spotting wounded prey, and I practically glowed with availability and desperation to be chosen. David courted me like a fairy tale prince, bringing flowers to my mother's house, charming her with his big smile and bigger promises. He talked about the future with certainty that made me dizzy with hope. We'd have a house with a garden, children who'd never doubt their worth, vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. I ate up every word like a starving person at a feast, not noticing how he never asked about my dreams, only painted pictures where I fit perfectly into his. The red flags were there, bright as warning flares, but I'd been trained to ignore my instincts. When he criticized my clothes, I saw it as caring guidance. When he suggested I quit the part-time job I'd finally gotten, I interpreted it as romantic desire to provide for me. When he started limiting my time with friends, claiming they were negative influences who didn't understand our love, I felt special, chosen above all others. The isolation happened so gradually I didn't notice the walls building around me until I was completely trapped inside them. By our wedding day, I'd already lost contact with most of my friends, convinced myself that my family was too demanding, and restructured my entire existence around David's needs and schedule. I walked down that aisle believing I was stepping into my real life, finally becoming who I was meant to be. The irony makes me sick now. I was actually walking deeper into a prison I'd helped build, carrying the keys to someone else while throwing away my own. The woman who promised to love, honor, and cherish David that day had no idea she was signing her own death warrant. Marriage revealed David's true nature like acid stripping paint from wood. The charming boyfriend disappeared overnight, replaced by a man who saw me as an employee rather than an equal. My job was to keep house, manage his social calendar, and anticipate his needs before he voiced them. I learned to read his moods like weather patterns, adjusting my behavior to avoid the storms that came when he felt inconvenienced or unappreciated. I convinced myself this was normal growing pains, that all couples went through adjustment periods. My mother reinforced this narrative, reminding me that marriage required sacrifice and that men needed to feel respected above all else. So I sacrificed more, respected harder, gave deeper. I took over all household responsibilities while he focused on his career. I made his favorite meals, kept his clothes pristine, entertained his colleagues, and smiled through dinner parties where I was introduced as his wife like I was an accessory rather than a person. When I suggested getting a job to contribute financially and have something of my own, he laughed and said I was too scattered to handle workplace pressures, that I was lucky he could provide so I didn't have to stress about such things. The words stung, but I swallowed the pain and told myself he was protecting me. When I brought up taking evening classes to finish my degree, he pointed out how expensive and time-consuming it would be, how it would interfere with our life together. I let the dream die quietly, adding it to the growing graveyard of abandoned hopes. Each concession felt like proof of my love, evidence of my commitment. I was slowly erasing myself and calling it devotion. The children came 3 years into our marriage, and I thought motherhood would fulfill the empty spaces inside me. Little Emma arrived first, perfect and demanding, followed 18 months later by baby Jake. I threw myself into parenting with the same intensity one brought to everything else, determined to give them the unconditional love I'd craved as a child. But David saw the children as extensions of his legacy, mini versions of himself who needed to reflect well on his parenting. He had rigid expectations about their behavior, their achievements, their potential. When Emma struggled in preschool, shy and artistic like I'd been, he insisted on tutors and activities to make her more competitive and outgoing. When Jake preferred books to sports, David enrolled him in Little League and soccer, ignoring the tears and protests. I became the buffer between David's demands and the children's needs, absorbing the tension and trying to protect them while keeping him satisfied. It was an impossible balance that left me exhausted and increasingly resentful, though I buried those feelings deep beneath layers of guilt and duty. The worst part was watching my children learn to perform for their father's approval the same way I had learned to perform for everyone else's. Emma developed anxiety at age 5, throwing up before family gatherings where she knew she'd be expected to sing or dance for relatives. Jake became a people pleaser who apologized constantly, even for things beyond his control. I saw my own patterns being passed down like a genetic curse, but I didn't know how to break cycles I was still trapped in myself. Every attempt to advocate for them was met with David's accusations that I was undermining his authority and raising weak, entitled children. My mother's demands intensified as the children grew older and David's expectations multiplied. She moved to an apartment 10 minutes away after selling the family home, claiming she needed to be closer to help with the grandchildren. What she really needed was continued access to my labor and emotional energy. Daily phone calls became daily visits, then daily emergencies that required my immediate attention. A leaky faucet, a confusing medical bill, loneliness that only I could cure by dropping everything and rushing to her side. David supported these interruptions because they made him look like a devoted son-in-law, and because my absence from home meant he could focus on work without being disturbed by domestic chaos. I was running 3 households, managing 2 sets of expectations, and raising 2 children while slowly disappearing into the background of everyone else's lives. The mirror became my enemy during this period because it showed a stranger with tired eyes, premature wrinkles, and a smile that never quite reached the surface. I'd gained weight from stress eating and lost muscle tone from never having time for self-care. My clothes hung on me like costumes for a play I no longer wanted to perform in, but the show had to go on because too many people depended on my performance. I started hiding in bathrooms to cry, setting my alarm for 4 in the morning so I could sob quietly into towels before beginning another day of giving until it hurt. Friends stopped calling because I never had time to talk, plans were constantly canceled for family emergencies, and my conversation had narrowed to updates about other people's lives rather than thoughts or dreams of my own. The breaking point approached slowly, then arrived all at once like a building collapse you see coming but can't prevent. Emma was 8, Jake was nearly 7, and I was existing rather than living, going through motions that had become automatic and meaningless. David's career was thriving, my mother's health was stable, the children were achieving at acceptable levels, and everyone around me was getting exactly what they needed while I withered away unnoticed. The final straw came on what should have been my 32nd birthday, though no one remembered the date except the automated greeting from my bank. I'd spent the morning at my mother's apartment, fixing her computer and organizing her medications. The afternoon was consumed by Emma's school conference, where I learned she was having social difficulties but was too afraid to tell me because she didn't want to burden me with more problems. The evening disappeared into helping Jake with a science project that was due the next day, making David's favorite dinner, and managing the household chaos that never seemed to end. By 10 o'clock, when I finally sat down with a cup of cold coffee, I realized I hadn't had a single conversation about myself, eaten a meal sitting down, or done anything that brought me even a moment of joy. This wasn't an unusual day. This was every day of my adult life, an endless loop of other people's needs consuming my existence while my own soul starved to death. I looked around the kitchen I'd cleaned 1,000 times, at the family photos where my smile grew progressively more strained, at the life I'd built by erasing myself piece by piece, and finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding for years. I was dying inside, had been dying for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be alive. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went for a walk alone. I told David I needed air, ignoring his questions about who would clean the kitchen and whether I'd be back in time to prepare clothes for tomorrow. The neighborhood streets were quiet, streetlights casting long shadows that reminded me of the paths I'd abandoned, the directions I'd never explored. For 30 minutes, I walked without destination or purpose, letting my mind wander to places it hadn't visited in decades. I remembered being 18, standing in my high school art room after everyone else had left, painting sunsets that existed only in my imagination. I remembered the scholarship letter I'd hidden in my jewelry box, the college acceptance I'd declined, the dreams I'd filed away like tax documents I'd never need again. I remembered having opinions about books, movies, politics, life itself. I remembered laughing until my stomach hurt, crying because I felt things deeply, getting angry when situations warranted anger rather than just absorbing pain and calling it love. Somewhere along the way, I'd confused martyrdom with virtue, self-erasure with selflessness. I'd become so good at anticipating others' needs that I'd lost touch with my own, so practiced at accommodating that I'd forgotten how to advocate. The walk ended too soon, but something fundamental had shifted during those quiet steps. I returned home to the same kitchen, the same family, the same life, but I was no longer the same woman who had left 30 minutes earlier. The fog of confusion I'd lived in for years was finally lifting, revealing the landscape of my own captivity. Change didn't happen overnight, but awareness created cracks in the foundation of my carefully constructed prison. I started small, claiming tiny spaces for myself while continuing to meet everyone's expectations. I bought a sketch pad and colored pencils, hiding them in the laundry room where I could steal 10-minute intervals to draw while waiting for clothes to finish washing. The first attempts were clumsy, my hands rusty from decades of neglect, but something inside me stirred with each stroke of color across white paper. I began taking slightly longer routes home from errands, driving past the community college where art classes were offered, imagining myself sitting in those bright studios again. I started listening to my body's signals, noticing when I was hungry, tired, or stressed instead of powering through on autopilot. These micro-rebellions felt enormous after years of self-denial, each one a small declaration that I still existed beneath the layers of other people's needs. David noticed the changes before anyone else, commenting on my distracted behavior, questioning why I was taking so long at the grocery store, expressing concern about my new normal sleep schedule now that I was going to bed before finishing every household task. His attention felt invasive rather than caring, like surveillance instead of love. I realized he'd become accustomed to my complete availability, expecting me to exist solely for his convenience and comfort. My mother also sensed the shift, increasing her demands and creating more urgent situations that required my immediate intervention. It was as if they could smell my growing independence and were instinctively tightening their grip before I could slip away entirely. The children were my biggest motivation and my greatest fear. I saw Emma's anxiety intensifying as she entered fourth grade, her perfectionism and people-pleasing tendencies mirroring my own destructive patterns. Jake was becoming increasingly withdrawn, losing himself in books and fantasy worlds rather than engaging with real life. They needed a mother who modeled self-worth and boundaries, not one who demonstrated how to disappear for others' comfort. But I was terrified that prioritizing my own needs would make me selfish, that setting boundaries would hurt the people I loved most. The internal war raged for months as I tried to navigate between self-preservation and the guilt that had been programmed into me since childhood. I started seeing a counselor in secret, using my mother's medical appointments as cover for my own therapy sessions. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that martyrdom wasn't love, that teaching my children to respect my needs would actually help them develop healthy relationship skills. She introduced concepts like emotional boundaries, codependency, and the difference between helping and enabling. For the first time, I had language for what I'd experienced, frameworks for understanding how I'd lost myself so completely. The sessions were painful, forcing me to confront years of suppressed anger and grief for the life I'd never lived. I mourned the woman I'd been before I learned to disappear, the dreams I'd sacrificed, the relationships I'd abandoned for the sake of keeping peace. But with grief came clarity, and with clarity came determination. I deserved more than a life spent in service to others' happiness while my own withered away. My children deserved a mother who showed them how to value themselves, not how to erase themselves for love. The first boundary I set was small but revolutionary. I enrolled in a Saturday morning art class at the community college. When David objected to the cost and time commitment, I explained that it wasn't negotiable rather than asking for permission. When my mother complained that Saturdays were her loneliest days and she needed me most then, I offered to visit Friday evenings instead but held firm about my Saturday plans. The guilt was overwhelming at first, their disappointment and confusion making me question whether I was being unreasonably selfish. But sitting in that studio again, surrounded by easels and natural light, mixing colors and creating something beautiful with my hands, I remembered who I'd been before I became everyone's solution to their problems. The other students were diverse in age and background, but united in their passion for creating something meaningful. I made friends for the first time in years, people who knew me as Sarah the artist rather than Sarah the wife, mother, daughter, and caretaker. They asked about my work, my techniques, my inspiration, treating me like a complete person with thoughts and talents worth exploring. These conversations reminded me that I had opinions about more than dinner menus and appointment schedules, that I possessed knowledge and creativity that existed independently of my relationships with others. David's resentment grew with each class, his criticism of my art becoming more cutting and personal. He questioned whether I was having some kind of midlife crisis, whether I was neglecting my real responsibilities for childish hobbies. His words stung because they echoed my own doubts, but they also clarified something important. He preferred me erased rather than authentic, diminished rather than growing, because my fullness threatened his control. My mother's resistance was more subtle but equally destructive. She began having mysterious health scares on Saturday mornings, calling with chest pains that disappeared when I arrived, balance problems that resolved themselves after I'd canceled my plans to stay with her. When I stopped responding to every emergency with immediate panic, she escalated to emotional manipulation, telling relatives I'd become cold and selfish, that success in my art class had made me think I was too good for my family. The accusations hurt because they played on my deepest fears about setting boundaries, but therapy helped me recognize the manipulation tactics I'd been subjected to for decades. Dr. Martinez explained that people who benefit from your boundaryless giving will often increase their demands when you start saying no, testing whether you'll return to your old patterns of accommodation. Standing firm required tolerating their disappointment and anger, accepting that their comfort wasn't my responsibility. This lesson was painful but liberating, freeing me from the exhausting cycle of managing everyone else's emotions while ignoring my own. I started applying boundaries in other areas of my life, saying no to PTA commitments that drained my energy, refusing to host every family gathering, limiting my availability for last-minute favors that disrupted my own plans. Each boundary felt like a small rebellion against years of conditioning, a step toward reclaiming the person I'd buried beneath layers of other people's expectations. The pushback was intense and sometimes cruel, but I was finally learning the difference between being loved for who I was and being appreciated for what I provided. The distinction was startling and necessary, revealing how many relationships in my life were transactional rather than genuine, based on my usefulness rather than my inherent worth. Emma noticed the changes first among my children, commenting that I seemed happier but also different, like I was thinking about things she couldn't see. She was right. For the first time in years, I was developing an inner life separate from my roles as caretaker and problem solver. I was reading books for pleasure, forming opinions about art and politics, rediscovering interests I'd abandoned decades earlier. Jake initially worried that my new activities meant I loved them less, but gradually began opening up about his own desires for independence and creativity. He started joining me in the laundry room while I sketched, telling me about stories he was writing, dreams he was afraid to share with his father. These conversations were precious gifts, opportunities to know my children as individuals rather than just responsibilities to manage. I began modeling different behavior for them, showing them that adults could say no, could have interests, could prioritize their own needs without abandoning their loved ones. Emma started art classes too, her anxiety decreasing as she found healthy ways to express her emotions. Jake began sharing his writing with teachers, discovering confidence I'd never seen in him before. Watching them flourish as I reclaimed my own identity confirmed that my changes were benefiting everyone, not just myself. But David's reaction grew increasingly hostile as the family dynamic shifted around him. He was losing control over the carefully ordered system where his needs took priority over everyone else's, where I absorbed all the emotional labor and domestic responsibilities while he focused solely on his career and preferences. My growing independence threatened the foundation of our marriage, which had been built on my willingness to disappear for his convenience. The crisis came when I announced my intention to return to school and finish my degree. The art classes had reignited my passion for learning and creativity, making me realize how much I'd missed intellectual stimulation and personal growth. I'd researched programs carefully, found options for working adults, calculated the financial impact, and prepared detailed plans for managing household responsibilities while pursuing my education. David's response was swift and brutal. He accused me of being selfish and irresponsible, of abandoning my family for fantasies that would never amount to anything meaningful. He threatened to withdraw his financial support, claiming I was wasting money we needed for the children's future and our retirement. When I suggested I could work part-time to pay for school, he laughed and said no employer would hire someone with my limited experience and outdated skills. His cruelty was breathtaking but also clarifying, revealing the depth of his investment in keeping me small and dependent. My mother allied herself with David, arguing that women my age needed to focus on their families rather than chasing dreams that belonged to younger people. She reminded me of all the sacrifices they'd made for me, all the ways I was disappointing them by prioritizing my own desires over their needs. The guilt was suffocating, but it was also familiar, and familiarity helped me recognize the manipulation for what it was. They weren't concerned about my well-being or the family's stability. They were afraid of losing their primary source of emotional labor and domestic service. The woman who had managed their lives, absorbed their stress, and asked for nothing in return was threatening to become someone who had needs and dreams of her own. The final revelation came during a family gathering where David publicly humiliated me for forgetting to bring his mother's favorite dessert, berating me in front of relatives while I stood there absorbing his anger like I'd been trained to do my entire life. But something was different this time. Instead of shrinking into myself and apologizing, I felt a cold fury rising from depths I'd forgotten existed. I looked around the room at faces that expected me to take this abuse silently, at people who had watched me disappear for years without ever questioning whether I was happy or fulfilled. I saw my children watching this interaction, learning from their father that this was how you treat someone you claim to love, and something inside me finally snapped. I walked out of that party, drove home alone, and spent the night packing my essential belongings and important documents. I wasn't leaving forever, not yet, but I needed space to think clearly without the constant pressure of everyone's expectations clouding my judgment. I checked into a hotel for the weekend, turned off my phone, and sat with the silence I'd been avoiding for decades. In that quiet space, the truth crystallized with startling clarity. I had given everything to people who gave me nothing but pain. My love, my energy, my dreams, my identity, my years had been poured into relationships that drained rather than nourished me. I had been so afraid of being selfish that I'd become selfless to the point of self-destruction, so terrified of disappointing others that I'd spent my entire adult life disappointing myself. The pattern was clear now, the cycle visible from beginning to end. I had attracted and enabled people who needed me to stay small so they could feel large, who required my weakness to maintain their strength. The ending of this story isn't what I expected when I began writing it. I thought I would conclude with dramatic confrontations, relationship explosions, and definitive breaks from everyone who had hurt me. Instead, I'm learning that real change happens quietly, in daily choices to honor my own needs alongside others, to love people without losing myself in the process. David and I are in marriage counseling, slowly rebuilding our relationship on foundations of mutual respect rather than his dominance and my submission. It's painful work that requires him to confront his controlling behaviors while I learn to maintain boundaries even when guilt tries to erode them. My mother is adjusting to a daughter who loves her but refuses to be consumed by her needs, who visits regularly but won't drop everything for manufactured emergencies. Some relationships haven't survived my transformation, friends and family members who preferred the accommodating version of me to the authentic one. Their departure stings but also creates space for connections based on genuine affection rather than convenience. I'm finishing my degree now, taking evening classes while working part-time at a local gallery. Emma and Jake are proud of their mother who models courage and self-respect, who shows them that adults can grow and change and pursue dreams at any age. The woman writing these words is different from the one who started this story, stronger but also softer, more careful about where she invests her energy but more generous with her authentic self. I gave them everything and they gave me nothing but pain, but that experience taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and a love that requires you to disappear isn't love at all. I am still learning to fill my own cup first, to love others from abundance rather than scarcity, to give freely rather than compulsively. It's the hardest and most necessary work I've ever done.